This is a tutorial on the Evaluate the Usefulness questions in the Advanced Higher History exam. In particular, this tutorial will go through how the marks are divided and how you can gain top marks in the final exam. First of all, it's important to recall how the marks are divided for the Evaluate the Usefulness. Now remember, it's a 12-mark question split into 4 sections. The first section is 2 to 3 marks, and that's for provenance, identifying the author, the date, and the purpose of the text. The next 2 to 3 marks are for interpretation, trying to identify points from the source and pick out what the historian has said. The next 5 marks are for wider contextual development, trying to build upon what the historian has already pointed out, and the final 2 marks are for bringing in 2 more historians, and particularly their point of view on that issue. Looking at the provenance marks in a little bit more depth, as I already said, it's split into 3 different sections: author, date, and purpose. But remember, the question asks you to evaluate the usefulness. So in provenance, you're trying to look for why is the author useful, or why is the date not useful? And a good way of doing this is using the framework provided in the bullet points. So just say the date is such and such, which is particularly useful because, or the author is such and such, which limits the usefulness because. And by doing this, what you're doing is you're directly answering the question and making sure that you're securing the marks that you need. So let's look at a particular example from the specimen paper provided by the SQA. This is actually for the American Civil War topic, but don't worry if you're not doing the American Civil War topic, as the principle of trying to answer the question is still the same. So let's look at this a little bit more depth. Before even answering the question, in the top of the source, it tells you a little bit more about who the author is and what the date is, and also possibly what book it's in, or just gives you that little bit more information about what the source actually is. And in this little top part of the source, you'll be able to find the author and the date. So in this particular example, we've got George Fitzhugh, who's a Virginian lawyer, and it was written in 1857. Now, this is all well and good, but we need to be able to make sure, why is this useful? Well, George Fitzhugh, he's from Virginia. This could mean that he has a biased opinion, which might limit the usefulness of the source. The date, however, is written in 1857, which might be quite useful because it's a part of a time period which had vast tensions over slavery and had other interesting things like the Dred Scott case and Bleeding Kansas. And to make sure you identify the purpose, you'll need to read the text, but again, you want to be able to identify what is the purpose of the text and why would that be useful. So in this particular case, the purpose is to defend the institution of slavery, which might have not that much usefulness because it might be one-sided. So let's look at a particular answer we might have to this question and how we can sort of adopt a structure to make sure that every time we answer it, we always get maximize marks. So here is a particular answer we have for that previous question. So again, we're using that framework to try and answer our question. So the date of the source is such and such, which is useful because. And feel free to look through that mark and pause and make sure you understand where the 3 marks you're getting for that particular part, which is provenance. The next 3 marks are for interpretation. This is trying to pick out what it's being said within the actual source. So I've underlined in red and in black the points that are made which are useful. Now, again, we have a framework. We're trying to create a structure of how we answer these and that's provided in the box on the bottom of this slide. So the source is largely useful in providing accurate information about such and such as, and you quote, which shows that. Now, reading that, it seems a bit fragmented and a bit jumpy, but it will flow and it will create a structure which makes the marker see that you fully understand the question and you're fully interacting with the source. So let's just show again an example of an answer that you might give to this. So you might say, firstly, the source is largely useful in providing accurate information about, and then you give the question, which is about slave conditions in the antebellum South, such as, give a quote, which shows that, and you give a little bit more of an explanation, and that's 1 mark. And you do that 3 times, and you make sure you secure 3 marks. Now, it must also be added that provenance and interpretation, you can only gain up to a maximum of 5 marks. So if you gain 3 marks in provenance, you only need to gain 2 marks in interpretation, and vice versa. You can gain 3 marks in interpretation and 2 marks in provenance. The third part of the Evaluate the Usefulness questions is wider contextual development. Now this is all for 5 marks, and what you're trying to look for is trying to develop on what is actually said within the source, but also you can say what's left out and try and develop and bring in new arguments which the source possibly hasn't considered. So a good way of doing that is trying to use some information that supports the source. So you might say, in development to these points made in the source, it could also be added, but also you want to show that some things might have possibly been left out, some historians' point of views might have been left out, and it's also really important to include them. So whilst the source is largely useful, it does, however, omit some key historical information limiting its overall usefulness, such as, and you bring on an argument which it hasn't fully considered. And if you use that framework, you'll fully gain those 5 marks. The final marks in the Evaluate the Usefulness questions is for historiography. Now, this is only 2 marks, which I presume would mean you only need to identify 2 historians. Now, this could be done in numerous ways. You could have integrated historians within the arguments of your wider contextual marks, or you could have built upon the points that are made by saying that some historians might have supported that. Or, as it's done here, you could just add it in at the end. So I've given an example of some historians that support the argument and try and challenge the argument, but all you need is 2 historians, and that will gain you the 2 marks. So again, we have a framework of how to answer that. A number of eminent historians have opinions on the issue of, just repeat whatever is said in the question. For example, the historian such and such argues that, and you do that twice and you'll gain your 2 marks. The final part of the Evaluate the Usefulness is just to give a nice conclusion to the end. Whilst it's not, you don't get any marks for concluding, it is, however, nice for the marker to show that you're properly answering the question. So just make a brief overall conclusion on the usefulness of the overall source. Only make it 1 sentence long, it doesn't need to be any much more than that, and just come down on one side of the argument. Is it useful or is it not useful? Overall, the source is useful, not useful, in providing information on, and just repeat whatever it said in the question. So in the case that I gave in the specimen paper, it would say the source is useful or not useful in providing information on slave conditions. And once you've done that, you should hopefully secure 12 marks and be on your way to getting a fantastic grade in the advanced higher course